Some broken things are meant to be left in the dark. But the forest knows a different truth. It knows that even the deepest cracks can be reached by the patient light of a single, determined moonbeam. And sometimes that is all it takes for a new forest to grow. Thea Lennox smelled of rain-soaked earth and chamomile tea, a scent utterly at odds with the resigned dread that settled in her stomach. The path to the outcast's cabin was deliberately untended, a snarl of grasping roots and thorny vines that snagged at the hem of her worn tunic. It was a path no one wanted to walk, leading to a wolf no one wanted to remember. The supply basket, heavy with salted meat, hard bread, and tins of preserves, dug into the crook of her arm. Another week, another delivery, another journey into the heart of her pack's collective shame. They called him the Lost Alpha, the feral son. But mostly, they didn't call him anything at all. They just sent the lowest of the low, an omega like her, to leave supplies on his porch and scurry away before the monster within could stir. Thea had been on this duty for a month, and every week the stories echoed in her mind. Alpha Ivan Hunt, the golden heir of the Silver Crescent Pack, captured by rogues on the cusp of his 18th birthday. The pack had celebrated his strength, his charisma, his destiny. His father, Alpha Marcus, had boasted that Ivan's wolf was the strongest the pack had seen in a generation, a rare golden wolf, luminous and enormous, the kind that appeared once in an age. Then he was gone. For 3 years, he was a ghost, a whispered horror story used to frighten pups. When the warriors finally found him, in a filth-caked cage deep in rogue territory, the celebrated heir was gone. In his place was a creature of scars and silence. They brought him home, but he was not home. He was a wild thing, trapped in a human shell, his eyes vacant, his body a roadmap of torture. He could not speak. He would not shift. He recognized no one. The healers said his wolf had retreated so deep within him that it was as if the creature had curled into the farthest corner of his soul and simply refused to exist. It was not a choice. It was survival. The rogues had forced him to shift again and again, using silver and pain to drag his wolf to the surface so they could study its golden radiance. And when his wolf could endure no more, it had done the only thing it could to protect them both. It had gone to sleep, and it would not wake. The pack healers tried their rituals, the elders their ancient chants. The head healer, old Marin, spent 3 days sitting beside Ivan, pressing her weathered hands to his temples, searching for the thread of his wolf. She found only silence. "The wolf is not dead," she told Alpha Marcus, her voice heavy with the weight of failed hope. "But it has buried itself beyond my reach. Perhaps beyond anyone's." Elder Soren, the keeper of the old ways, tried moonlit ceremonies and sacred herbs. He chanted until his voice gave out, then sat in the cabin for an hour, watching Ivan stare at the floor with those hollow gray eyes. When Soren emerged, his face was ashen. "There is nothing to hold on to," he told the gathered council. "His mind is an empty room. The boy we knew is gone." Even Alpha Marcus himself came once, in those early weeks. He stood in the doorway of the cabin, looking at his firstborn son, and Thea, who had heard this story from the kitchen staff, who had heard it from the guards, could imagine the scene. The great Alpha, who commanded hundreds, standing helpless before a boy who could not lift his head. "Ivan," Marcus had said, his voice rough. "Son, look at me." Ivan had not looked, had not blinked, had not breathed differently. Marcus had stayed for 20 minutes. When he left, he did not return. Finally, with a heavy heart that the pack saw as pragmatic grief, Alpha Marcus declared his younger son, Reese, the new heir. Ivan, the broken relic, was moved to this remote cabin at the edge of their territory, to be forgotten with as much dignity as the pack could muster, which, Thea had learned, was very little. Her instructions were simple: leave the basket on the porch, knock once, and leave immediately. Never try to look inside, never try to speak to him, never, ever linger. Thea, however, was not good at following rules that felt cruel. On her first trip, she had done as she was told, her heart hammering against her ribs. But on the second, a bitter wind had been blowing, and the thought of the food freezing before he could get it had gnawed at her. She had hesitated, pushed the door open just a crack, and slid the basket inside. That was when she first saw him. He wasn't the snarling beast of the whispers. He was just a man, or the shadow of one, sitting on a threadbare rug before a cold hearth. He was unnaturally still, his large frame folded in on itself, and even diminished by years of captivity and neglect. She could see the bones of what he had been, the broad shoulders, the height, the architecture of strength that starvation and grief had hollowed, but not erased. His hair, the tawny gold the stories had celebrated, had grown long and matted, falling past his shoulders in tangled ropes. Scars, silvery and puckered, crawled up his neck and disappeared into his ragged hairline. But it was his eyes that had stolen her breath. They were a pale, hollowed-out gray, and they stared at a spot on the floor as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. He hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. He was a statue of grief. And in that moment, Thea's fear had evaporated, replaced by a profound and aching sorrow. He wasn't a monster. He was just empty. She had returned to the pack house that day and found herself standing at the kitchen window, staring at nothing, her reflection a ghost in the glass. Auburn hair pulled back in its usual braid, green eyes too large for her freckled face, hands rough from years of scrubbing and carrying. She was 21 years old, and she had never felt a pull toward anything in her life with the certainty she felt now. It wasn't pity. Pity was a coin you tossed to feel better about walking away. This was something else. She had looked into that empty room behind his eyes and thought, with a conviction she could not explain, someone is still in there. Maybe she recognized it because she knew what it was to be invisible. As an Omega orphan, she had spent her whole life being looked through, spoken around, considered less. She knew the particular loneliness of existing in a room full of people who did not see you. And she thought, perhaps, that was exactly why she could see him. Now, reaching the small clearing, Thea set the basket down and took a steadying breath. The cabin was small, rough-hewn, but sturdy. Smoke curled from the chimney today, a good sign. It meant he was moving, tending to the basics of survival. She picked up the basket and approached the porch. The rule was to knock and leave. Instead, she knocked softly and waited. Silence. She pushed the door open. The scent of wood smoke, unwashed linen, and a sharp, wild musk hit her. It was the scent of a wolf who had forgotten his humanity, a lonely animal smell that spoke of deep pain. He was there, in the same spot as always, before the now glowing embers of the fire. His back was to her. He wore the same dark, shapeless clothes. His golden hair was a long, tangled mat. "Hello, Ivan," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. There was no response. She stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind her, shutting out the biting wind. She walked over to the small, dusty table and began to unpack the supplies. "They packed you some of the honey cakes you used to like," she murmured, her voice a low, continuous thread in the oppressive silence. "Sarah in the kitchens remembers how you'd always sneak one before dinner. She still saves them for you." She placed the tin of cakes on the table, separate from the rest. She chattered on, her voice the only sound besides the crackle of the fire. She spoke of small, meaningless things, the color of the changing leaves, a funny argument between two pups in the village square, the taste of the first autumn apples. She didn't expect an answer. She just wanted to fill the emptiness with something other than silence. She wanted him to hear a voice that wasn't screaming in his memory. As she worked, she let her eyes drift over him. He hadn't moved a muscle. It was like talking to a stone wall. Yet she persisted. She didn't know why she kept coming back, not really. Not in any way she could put into words. It wasn't hope. Hope required expectation, and she had none. It was something quieter than hope. It was the stubborn, illogical belief that no living thing should sit alone in a dark room and be forgotten. That even if he could not hear her, speaking to him was still the right thing to do. When the basket was empty, she folded the cloth liner neatly and placed it back inside. "Well, that's everything," she said, her tone gentle. "I'll be back next week. I hope you stay warm." She turned to leave, her hand on the door latch. And then she saw it, a flicker of movement. She froze, her breath catching. His head, ever so slightly, had turned. It wasn't much, a motion so small she might have imagined it. But his ear was now angled toward her. He was listening. A fragile tendril of something unfurled in her chest. It was the first sign, the first crack in the wall of nothingness. She offered a small, sad smile to his back. "Goodbye, Ivan." She slipped out of the cabin, her heart a little lighter than when she had arrived. The path back didn't seem quite so tangled. The thorns didn't snag her quite so viciously. For the first time, she felt that this wasn't a punishment. It was a purpose. The weeks bled into months, and autumn deepened into the hard frost of early winter. Thea's weekly visits became the anchor of her otherwise monotonous life. As an Omega, her duties were often invisible, her presence overlooked. She fetched and carried, mended and cleaned, existing in the background of the vibrant pack life she could never fully join. But in the silence of Ivan's cabin, she felt seen, even if he never looked at her. She had stopped just dropping off supplies. Now she stayed. She would unpack the food, tidying the small, sparse space as she did. She'd wipe down the table, sweep the floor, add a log to his fire. And she would talk. She told him about the pack, not the politics or the gossip, but the small moments of life. She described the way the frost painted the windows of the great hall, the sound of the warriors training in the yard, the scent of pine boughs being brought in for the winter festival. She never asked him questions. She never mentioned his past, or the rogues, or the scars that mapped his skin. She simply offered him a window into a world he had been locked away from, a world that was still turning. The pack had not entirely forgotten Ivan, though their remembering was a hollow, obligatory thing. Twice during those months, the healer Marin made the trip to the cabin, more out of duty than belief. Both times, Thea happened to be there, and both times, she watched the old woman examine Ivan with careful, clinical hands, while he sat rigid and unresponsive. "Still no wolf," Marin murmured the second time, shaking her head. She spoke about him as if he were not in the room, as if his ears were as empty as his eyes. "The connection is severed. I've seen it before, in wolves broken by silver torture. The spirit retreats to survive, and after long enough, it simply fades, like a fire that's been banked too long." She patted Thea's arm with something that was meant to be kindness. "You're a good girl for coming, but don't pour your heart into an empty vessel, child. There's nothing left to fill." Thea said nothing. She waited for Marin to leave, then she sat on the floor and read Ivan a story about two foxes who tricked a bear out of his honey. She didn't believe in empty vessels. She believed in patience. The changes were glacial, almost imperceptible, but they were there. After that first slight turn of his head, he began to react more. When she entered, his shoulders would lose a fraction of their tension. When she spoke, his breathing would deepen, evening out. One week, she was recounting a story about a clumsy beta who had tripped and sent a whole cart of laundry tumbling into the mud, and she let out a small laugh. In the silence that followed, she heard a sound. A rough, scraping intake of breath from him. It wasn't a laugh, not even close, but it was a reaction. His body had responded to the sound of her joy. She started bringing him things. A smooth gray stone from the riverbed. A brightly colored feather from a bluebird. Small, simple things that she would place on the mantelpiece, narrating where she had found them. He never touched them, not while she was there, but they were never thrown in the fire. They remained, a small collection of her presence in his desolate world. One day, she arrived to find the cabin door slightly ajar. Wariness prickled her skin. He never left it open. She pushed it gently, her heart thumping. The cabin was empty. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Had he wandered off? Was he hurt? She scanned the small room and her eyes landed on the table. In the center of the dusty surface, where she always placed the honey cakes, sat a single, scraggly wildflower. It was a late-blooming aster, its purple petals slightly wilted, but it was undeniably a deliberate placement. Her breath hitched. He had gone outside. He had picked a flower, and he had left it for her. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and sudden. She walked to the table and gently picked it up, her fingers trembling. She looked toward the closed door of the small bedroom, the one she had never dared to approach. She could feel his presence from that direction. He was in there, hiding. But he had left her a message. It was a thank you. It was an acknowledgement. It was a word in a language they were inventing together. A language that did not require sound, only sincerity. She tucked the flower into the band of her apron, feeling its fragile stem against her skin. "It's beautiful, Ivan," she whispered to the closed door. "Thank you." She didn't get a response, but she didn't need one. She unpacked the supplies with a renewed sense of purpose, her movements light. She told him about the upcoming hunter's moon, how the pack was preparing for the celebratory run. She found herself talking about her own wolf, a quiet, gentle creature who loved the feeling of soft moss under her paws, but was too timid to enjoy the wildness of the pack runs. "Maybe you understand that," she said softly. "Feeling like your own skin, your own instincts, don't quite fit." Before she left, she placed a fresh tin of honey cakes where the flower had been. When she stepped outside, she saw him. He was standing at the edge of the woods, partially hidden by the trunk of a large oak. He wasn't looking at her, but at the cabin. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, his head snapped in her direction. For the first time, their eyes met across the clearing. His were no longer hollow. They were watchful, intelligent, and filled with a stark, gut-wrenching pain. He held her gaze for a long second, a silent communion that spoke volumes. And in that look, something passed between them that Thea could not name but would never forget. It was not magic. It was not fate. It was simpler than that, and rarer. It was one person seeing another, truly seeing them, and choosing not to look away. Then, as if the effort was too much, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest. Thea stood frozen, her hand pressed to her chest where the flower was tucked. He had looked at her. He had seen her. The lost alpha was still lost, but he was starting to look for a way home. And she was the path. The encounter in the clearing marked a profound shift. The fragile bridge of trust they had been building, plank by solitary plank, could now bear more weight. When Thea arrived the following week, Ivan was not sitting by the fire. He was at the table, his large hands resting on the wooden surface, palms down. His head was bowed, his long golden hair obscuring his face, but he was waiting for her. Her heart did a little flutter. She gave him a soft smile he might not have seen. "Hello, Ivan." She began her usual routine, but the atmosphere was different. It was charged with a quiet anticipation. He remained at the table as she put away the supplies, his stillness a tangible presence rather than an absence. She found herself talking more about herself that day, not just the goings-on of the pack. She told him about her parents, who had been lost in a border skirmish when she was a pup, leaving her to be raised by the pack community, which meant being raised by no one in particular. She spoke of her loneliness, not in a plea for pity, but as a simple statement of fact, a shared piece of her own brokenness. "I think that's why I understand you," she said, surprising herself with the admission. "Not the pain, I could never understand that. But the silence after. The way a room full of people can feel emptier than a room where you're alone. I know that feeling." As she spoke, she saw one of his hands curl into a tight fist, his knuckles white. The gesture was so full of contained emotion that it made her pause. She had touched a nerve. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to upset you." She waited, her breath held. Slowly, painstakingly, his fist uncurled. He lifted his head and his gaze met hers. His gray eyes were turbulent, a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. He opened his mouth, his lips parting. A rough, guttural sound escaped, a noise of pure effort, like grinding stones. He was trying to speak. The strain was visible in the cords of his neck, the taut line of his jaw. But no words came. A look of devastating frustration crossed his face. He slammed his fist on the table, a single sharp crack that made her jump. The sound echoed the shattering of his own control. He pushed himself away from the table, the chair scraping harshly against the floor, and retreated to the dark corner of the room, turning his back to her once more. He had tried for her, and he had failed. Thea's heart ached for him. The urge to go to him, to touch his shoulder, was overwhelming, but her instincts, honed by months of careful observation, told her to stay put. He wasn't pushing her away, he was hiding his shame. Pushing him now would be a violation of the trust he had so tentatively offered. She took a deep, steadying breath. "It's okay, Ivan," she said, her voice impossibly gentle. "It's okay. You don't have to talk. I'm glad you're here. That's enough. That will always be enough." She finished her tasks in a softer silence, the air thick with his failure and her quiet reassurance. When it was time to leave, she hesitated at the door. "I brought you something," she said. She pulled a worn, leather-bound book from her satchel. "It was my mother's. It's just old pack stories and legends. I thought, maybe I could read some to you next week?" She placed the book on the table, a promise of her return. "If you want me to." She didn't wait for a sign. She left, closing the door on the heavy silence within. The entire week, she was consumed with worry. Had she pushed too hard? Had his failed attempt to speak sent him spiraling back into the void? When she returned, her stomach was a knot of anxiety. The cabin was quiet as she approached. She pushed the door open, her heart in her throat. He was sitting on the rug by the fire again, his back to her, just as he had been in the beginning. Despair washed over her. She had broken him again. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw the book. It was on the floor beside him, open. He hadn't been able to read it. Perhaps the words were a jumble to him, but he had taken it from the table. He had opened it. He had been waiting. Relief made her dizzy. She walked softly into the room and sat on the floor, a careful distance away. She didn't speak of his attempt last week. She simply picked up the book. "This one is called The Wolf and the Winter Star," she began, her voice low and even. She read, the ancient words filling the small cabin. It was a story of a lone wolf who followed a single star through the longest winter, believing it would lead him to a new pack. She read for nearly an hour. Ivan never moved, but the tension in his broad shoulders seemed to lessen with every word, his posture softening until he was no longer a rigid statue of pain, but simply a man listening to a story. When she finished the tale, a comfortable silence settled between them. She sat there for a long time, just breathing the same air, warmed by the same fire. There was something about that silence that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The particular quality of being quiet with another person and feeling no need to fill it, no awkwardness, no absence, just presence. Two people, breathing. She was gathering her things to leave when his voice, rough and cracked with disuse, rasped through the quiet. "Why?" She froze, unsure if she had heard it correctly. She turned to look at him. He was still facing the fire, but his head was cocked, listening for her answer. "Why do you keep coming? Each word was an immense effort. A rock heaved from the depths of his silent throat. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, raw and vulnerable. The kind of question a man asks when he has forgotten why anyone would bother. Thea's heart swelled. She looked at the strong line of his back, the tangled golden hair, the scars she could just see on his neck. She saw not the pack's failure, but the man who had survived the unthinkable, the man who had left her a flower, the man who had tried to speak, the man who was asking for a reason to hope. Her answer was simple, spoken as a quiet truth into the space between them. Because you're still in there. A shudder went through his entire body. It was a tremor that seemed to start deep in his bones and ripple outward. He didn't speak again, but as she left the cabin that day, Thea knew with absolute certainty that she had been heard. And for the first time, she felt he was truly listening. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the Omega quarters, she pressed the dried wildflower between the pages of an old journal and thought about what she had said. Because you're still in there. It was not the kind of answer that made logical sense. She had no proof. She had months of silence, a single turned head, a flower on a table. It was nothing by any reasonable measure. But Thea had never lived by reasonable measures. She had lived by the quiet certainty of her own heart. And her heart told her that a man who picks a wildflower for a woman he has never spoken to is not empty. He is full of things he cannot yet say. Ivan's question and her answer became an unspoken covenant between them. The dam of his silence had not burst, but a crack had formed, and through it, life was beginning to trickle. He didn't become a chatterbox overnight. Sentences remained a struggle, his voice a gravelly echo of what it must have once been. But he would speak. A single word, cold, would prompt her to add another log to the fire. Hungry would have him gesturing toward the supplies. And one day, as she was describing the golden light of the sunset over the western ridge, he murmured, "Pretty." His gray eyes fixed not on the window, but on the way the firelight caught the copper threads in her hair. She felt the word land in her chest like a warm stone dropped into still water. She didn't know if he meant the sunset or her. She didn't ask. Some words are more beautiful when they are left to mean everything. Each word he spoke was a gift, a hard-won victory she cherished. Their routine evolved. She still read to him, but now he would sit closer, sometimes on the other end of the rug, a silent companion instead of a distant figure. He started to help her. When she brought in firewood, he would take the load from her arms without a word, his scarred hands brushing hers in the transfer. When she swept, he would move the single chair out of her way. They were small gestures of partnership, a silent dance of domesticity that felt more intimate than any conversation. There is a kind of love that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with thunder or revelation. It arrives in the ordinary moments, in the passing of a plate, the sharing of warmth, the quiet act of making room for another person in the small space of your life. That was what was growing between them, unnamed and unexamined, as natural as moss on stone. Thea's world, once confined to the drudgery of Omega tasks, now revolved around these hours in the cabin. She found herself noticing things for him, a particular bird song she could describe, a strangely shaped cloud, the exact shade of green of new moss, hoarding these details to share with him like small treasures. In turn, he started sharing his world with her. He would leave things on the table for her to find. A hawk's feather, a piece of quartz that glittered with mica, a perfectly formed pine cone. They were his words, his way of showing her the things he saw on his solitary wanderings. Every gift said the same thing. I was out there, and I thought of you. His wolf, the wild and broken thing the pack feared, was also stirring. Thea could feel it in the way his presence seemed to fill the room, a low thrum of energy that was no longer just feral pain. It was becoming something else. One afternoon, a rogue wolf, young and desperate, strayed too close to the edge of the territory. Its howl, sharp with hunger and loneliness, echoed through the trees. Thea, who was outside stacking the last of the firewood, froze. Before she could even process the potential danger, the cabin door flew open. Ivan stood there, framed in the doorway, his body a taut line of aggression. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound far deeper and more powerful than any human noise. His gray eyes had bled to a burning gold, his pupils slitted. It was the alpha, raw and untamed, rising to protect. The rogue howled again, closer this time. Ivan took a step forward, placing himself between Thea and the sound. He didn't look at her, his entire focus on the threat in the woods. "Ivan," she said softly. Her voice seemed to cut through his feral focus. His golden eyes flickered to her for a second, the intensity softening for a barest moment, a flash of recognition before snapping back to the woods. He let out another growl, this one a clear command. "Leave." The forest fell silent. The rogue, clearly no match for the dormant power it had awakened, had wisely fled. Ivan stood there for another long minute, his body tense, listening. Slowly, the rigid lines of his posture eased. The gold in his eyes receded, leaving the familiar stormy gray. He turned to her, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. He looked at her, then at his own hands, as if surprised by what they were capable of. "You safe?" he rasped. "I'm safe," she assured him, her heart thudding. "You kept me safe." He seemed to ponder this, the concept of him being a protector rather than a danger. He gave a short, jerky nod and retreated back into the cabin, but he left the door open behind him. It was an invitation. She followed. The incident, however, did not go unnoticed. A pack warrior on patrol had heard the alpha's growl and reported it. The news that the feral son had displayed a flicker of his old dominance sent a ripple through the pack. A few days later, Thea arrived at the cabin to find an unexpected and unwelcome visitor. Reese, Ivan's younger brother and the new alpha heir, stood on the porch, his arms crossed. He had the same strong build as Ivan and the same tawny hair, but his was cropped short and clean. His face was unmarked, his skin smooth, his expression radiating an easy confidence that bordered on arrogance. Two of his beta guards stood behind him. "Omega," Reese said, his tone dismissive. "My father sent me. We heard a disturbance." Thea's jaw tightened. "It was nothing. A rogue got too close." "And my brother handled it, I hear," Reese said, a hint of something unreadable in his voice. Was it surprise or annoyance? He peered past her toward the closed door. "Is he in there?" "He is," Thea said, positioning herself subtly in front of the door. Reese's presence felt like an intrusion, a harsh note in the quiet world she and Ivan had built. "I'd like to see him." "It's not a good time," she said firmly. "He needs his routine. Disruption sets him back." Reese laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Routine? Omega, he's been sitting in a dark room for 3 years. My father wants to know if there's any truth to this, if the alpha within is truly stirring." He pushed past her, shoving the door open without knocking. "Ivan? Brother?" The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, was instantly violated. The air grew thick with tension. Ivan was sitting by the fire, but at the sound of Reese's voice, he went rigid. His head snapped up, and a low growl started in his chest. Reese stopped short, his arrogant demeanor faltering at the sight of his brother. He hadn't seen Ivan up close in over a year, and the raw, scarred reality was clearly a shock. "Gods, Ivan," he breathed, his pity as loud as an insult. "Look at you." That was the wrong thing to say. Ivan surged to his feet, his movements unnervingly fast. The growl deepened into a snarl, his teeth bared. The gold was back in his eyes, burning with fury. This wasn't the protective instinct from the other day. This was the cornered animal, threatened in his own den by the man who had taken his birthright. Not through malice, perhaps, but the effect was the same. "Easy, brother," Rhys said, taking a step back, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt. His guards tensed, ready to move. "Stop it!" Thea's voice cut through the standoff. She moved quickly, stepping between the brothers, facing Ivan. She put herself directly in the path of his rage. "Ivan, look at me." His snarling gaze was fixed on Rhys, the source of the insult, the symbol of everything he had lost. "Ivan," she repeated, her voice softer now, but firm. She reached out slowly, her hand open and non-threatening. "It's me. It's Thea. You're safe." His golden eyes flickered toward her. The snarl lessened, but the growl continued, a low vibration of rage. He was trapped between his trauma and his trust in her. "They'll leave," she promised him, never breaking eye contact. She then turned her head slightly, her gaze pinning a shocked Rhys. "Get out. Now." "Omega, you don't give me orders," Rhys began, bristling. "He sees you as a threat," she said, her voice low and fierce, and Omega daring to command an air. "Your pity is like acid to him. Every moment you are in here, you are undoing months of progress. Do you want to help your brother? Then leave him in peace. Get out." For a moment, Rhys looked like he would argue, his pride wounded. But then he looked at Ivan's trembling form, the sheer agony and fury warring in his brother's eyes, and the fierce defiance on Thea's face. This small, auburn-haired Omega standing between a traumatized alpha and an heir with 2 armed guards, and not flinching. He saw the truth in her words. With a curse under his breath, he turned on his heel. "This isn't over," he muttered, and then he and his guards were gone. The harsh sunlight from the open door vanished as it clicked shut. The cabin was silent again, but the peace was shattered. Ivan was shaking, his breath coming in harsh gasps. The gold faded from his eyes, leaving them wide with a haunted, panicked look. He backed away from her, stumbling until his back hit the wall, and slid to the floor, wrapping his arms around his head as if to block out the world. A low, wounded sound, a keen of pure misery, escaped his lips. Thea's heart broke. She approached him slowly, kneeling on the floor a few feet away. She didn't touch him. She just sat there, a quiet, steadfast presence in the wreckage of his composure. "I'm here, Ivan," she whispered. "I'm not leaving. You don't have to be okay right now. You just have to let me sit here." He didn't respond, but his tortured keening slowly subsided, replaced by ragged breathing. She had stood for him. She had chosen him over an heir, over protocol, over every rule the pack had ever taught her about knowing her place. And in the depths of his retreat, a part of him recognized it. He was not alone in his fight. The confrontation with Rhys left a deep scar on their fragile peace. For 2 weeks, Ivan retreated into a near catatonic state, a silent ghost haunting the corners of the cabin. He wouldn't meet Thea's eyes. He wouldn't eat the honeycakes. He wouldn't touch the new book she brought. He was lost again in the fog of his trauma, and Thea was terrified she couldn't pull him out this time. But she didn't stop coming. She didn't stop talking. She didn't stop sitting in the quiet with him, a stubborn beacon of warmth in his self-imposed darkness. She cleaned his cabin, stoked his fire, and filled the silence with stories, her voice a constant, gentle pressure against the walls he had rebuilt. "He was wrong, you know," she told his unmoving back one afternoon, her chin resting on her drawn-up knees. "Rhys, what he sees when he looks at you isn't you. It's just what happened to you. It's like looking at a tree struck by lightning and seeing only the scorch mark, and forgetting the tree was ever strong enough to reach the sky." She paused, picking at a thread on her sleeve. "But I don't look at the scorch mark, Ivan. I look at the roots. And yours go deep." Slowly, her patience began to wear down his defenses. It started with him turning to face the fire when she was there, instead of the wall. Then one day, she arrived to find one of the honeycakes gone from the tin. A small victory, but it felt monumental. The approaching full moon cast a pall of anxiety over the pack. For a normal wolf, It was a time of power and release. For a damaged one, it could be a tipping point into uncontrollable madness. The elders whispered that if Ivan's wolf was truly stirring, the full moon would bring forth the feral beast in its full, untamed glory. The official pack order was for the cabin to be barred from the outside, for everyone's safety. Thea overheard the betas assigned the task talking with grim satisfaction in the kitchens. They were going to lock the monster in its cage. The thought of Ivan, alone and terrified, facing the agonizing pull of the moon while trapped in a box? A cage, just like the one the rogues had kept him in, was unbearable to her. She made a decision. On the evening of the full moon, she packed a small satchel not with supplies, but with blankets and a thermos of calming herbal tea. She told the kitchen staff she was feeling unwell and retired to her small room in the Omega quarters. But as dusk fell and the great silver disk of the moon began to rise, she slipped out through the back window of her quarters. She took the old deer trail that ran parallel to the main path, the one the patrols didn't bother with because it was narrow, overgrown, and led nowhere anyone important wanted to go. She moved quickly and quietly, her small frame an advantage for once, slipping between the close-set pines like a shadow. When she reached the clearing, she could see the cabin from the tree line. The two betas were there, sliding a heavy iron bar across the outside of the cabin door. She waited, crouched in the undergrowth, her heart hammering, until they finished their work and headed back toward the main territory, their duty done. She gave them a 10-minute lead. Then she crossed the clearing, her boots crunching softly on the frost-hardened ground. The iron bar was heavy, but she was stronger than she looked. Years of hauling water and firewood had seen to that. She gripped it with both hands and pulled, the metal grinding against the brackets. It took 3 attempts, her arms shaking, before it finally slid free and fell to the ground with a dull thud. She leaned it against the wall where it would not be immediately visible from the path, then pushed the door open and slipped inside, closing it firmly behind her. The cabin was pitch black, the fire a bed of dying coals. The air was electric, thick with a primal energy that raised the hair on her arms. "Ivan?" she whispered into the darkness. A low, agonized groan answered her from the corner of the room. She could just make out his silhouette, curled into a tight ball on the floor. His body was trembling violently. The moon was rising, and whatever was left of his wolf, that sleeping, buried creature, was being pulled to the surface by a force older than memory. She moved quickly, using a flint and steel to light a single candle and then to coax the embers in the hearth back to life. The room filled with a soft, warm glow. She turned to him. His face was slick with sweat, his jaw clenched so hard the muscles stood out like cords, his eyes screwed shut in agony. "I'm here, Ivan," she said, her voice a calm anchor in his storm. "You're not alone. You're not in a cage. You're in your cabin, and I'm right here." "Go," he gasped, the word torn from him. "Please, Thea, go. It hurts. Something is waking up. I can't." His voice broke into a groan that was more animal than human. The wolf. After years of dormancy, years of hiding in the deepest recess of his being, the wolf was stirring. Not gently, not willingly, but dragged to consciousness by the irresistible pull of the full moon, like a creature being wrenched from the bottom of a deep, dark lake. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She knelt on the floor near him, not touching, just being present. "Breathe with me, Ivan. Just breathe." What came next was nothing like the stories. The stories made shifting sound fluid, a graceful dance between forms. This was not that. This was a body at war with itself. The first crack of bone echoed in the small room, hideously loud, and Ivan screamed. It was a raw, shattered sound, the sound of a man being broken from the inside. His spine arched at an angle that made Thea's stomach lurch, and she could see the vertebrae pressing against his skin like something trying to claw its way out. Then nothing. The change stalled, his body locked in a half-state of agony, muscles spasming, tendons taut as bowstrings. His wolf, so long asleep, did not remember how to do this. The pathways that should have been smooth and instinctive had atrophied like unused muscles, and every inch of the transformation had to be forced through scar tissue, physical and spiritual. He was sobbing now, dry, heaving sobs that had no tears, his fingers clawing at the wooden floor until his nails splintered. "It won't. It can't. Thea, I can't." "You can," she said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands were trembling in her lap. She moved closer, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Listen to me, Ivan. Your wolf is not your enemy. He went away to save you. He hid so you could survive. And now he's trying to come back, and it hurts because he's been gone so long. But he's yours. He was always yours. Let him come home." Another crack, another scream. Fur began to sprout along his arms in ragged patches. Golden, the color of late summer wheat, shot through here and there with streaks of white where scars ran beneath the skin. But the fur receded almost immediately, his body rejecting the change, the wolf surging forward and being pulled back like a tide that could not decide whether to come in or go out. The pain was monstrous. Ivan's screams had become wordless, guttural sounds, his human voice shredding into something lower, rougher. His bones were breaking and reforming, each attempt a little further than the last, each retreat a little less complete. It was like watching someone learn to walk after years of paralysis, every step excruciating, every fall devastating, every small gain purchased in pure suffering. Thea was crying. She couldn't help it. The tears ran silently down her face as she watched this man fight the hardest battle of his life. But she did not look away, and she did not stop talking. "You're doing it, Ivan. I can see him. Your wolf. He's golden, just like they said. He's so beautiful. Keep going. I'm right here. I'm not leaving." Through the haze of his agony, his eyes found hers. Half gray, half gold. The man and the wolf staring at her from the same tortured face. He was holding on to her. She was the rope, and he was climbing. The transformation completed not with a final elegant flourish, but with a ragged, shuddering collapse, like a building that had been trembling for an hour finally giving way. Where the broken man had been, there now lay a wolf. He was magnificent, and he was ruined. And he was the most beautiful thing Thea had ever seen. He was larger than any wolf she could have imagined, his fur the color of burnished gold, deep, rich, and warm, as if he carried the last light of sunset in his coat. But the gold was interrupted by streaks and patches of silver white, scar tissue translated into fur, a map of his suffering woven into his very being. One ear was torn, ragged at the tip. He was panting in great, heaving breaths, his powerful body trembling with exhaustion and residual pain, his massive paws splayed on the wooden floor, as if the earth itself might fall away. He didn't move for a long time. He lay there, sides heaving, golden eyes staring at nothing. And Thea's heart seized, because for a terrible moment she thought his wolf had surfaced only to be as hollow as the man had been. Then he blinked. He turned his great head, slowly, and looked at the room, at the fire, at his own massive paws. And then his golden gaze landed on her. Thea remained perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. The wolf of the pack's nightmares was before her. But there was no rage in his eyes. There was only confusion, exhaustion, and a deep, soul-shaking vulnerability. And beneath all of that, recognition. He knew her. He whined softly, a low, questioning sound. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "You did it, Ivan. You came back." He tried to stand, his legs shaking like a newborn foal's, and collapsed almost immediately. He tried again, managed 2 steps, then his legs buckled and he sank down with a whimper of frustration. On the 3rd try he found his balance, unsteady, clumsy, like a creature relearning the use of limbs it had not worn in years. and took one trembling step toward her, then another, until he was right in front of her. He lowered his massive head and nudged her hand with his wet nose. She tentatively reached out and stroked the thick golden fur on his head. A low rumble started in his chest. Not a growl, but a sound of pure, exhausted contentment. Overwhelmed, he sank to the floor, his body curling around her like a question mark, his heavy head coming to rest in her lap. His golden eyes closed as a deep sigh shuddered through him. She sat there for the rest of the night, her hand moving through his fur in long, steady strokes, her quiet presence a guard against the shadows. The full moon shone through the single window, bathing them in silver light, the gold of his fur and the copper of her hair, the stillness of trust after the violence of transformation. He was not a lost cause. He was not an empty vessel. He was just a man who had needed someone to believe in him long enough for him to remember how to believe in himself. The dawn was breaking, and with it, a new beginning. The sun rose, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, and with its light, the wolf began to stir. Thea had not slept, her fingers tangled in his thick golden fur, her back resting against the hearth. The rumble in his chest had been a constant, comforting presence through the night. As the first rays of sun pierced the window, a tremor ran through him. A soft whine escaped his muzzle. The process of shifting back was quicker, less brutal than the transformation had been, as if his body, having remembered the path, could retrace it with less resistance. It was a fluid unraveling, bone and muscle contracting, fur receding, the magnificent golden wolf giving way to the man. He lay on the floor, curled on his side, his scarred skin flushed in the morning light, his breathing deep and peaceful. Thea averted her eyes and draped one of the blankets she had brought over him. His eyes fluttered open. They were gray again, clear and calm, the storm clouds of his trauma momentarily parted. He looked at the blanket covering him, then at her, sitting so close, her face tear-streaked and tired, and more beautiful than anything he had ever seen, though he did not have the words for that yet. "Thea," he breathed, his voice still rough, but softer than she had ever heard it. "You stayed." "I told you I would," she replied gently. He pushed himself into a sitting position, clutching the blanket around himself. He looked at his own hands, flexing his fingers, a marveling expression on his face. I was in control," he said, the words full of wonder. "At the end, I could feel the rage, the pain, but there was something else, something steady. You were there, and I could hold on to that." "You did the holding, Ivan," she said. "I just stayed in the room." He shook his head slowly, his gray eyes finding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You say that like it's a small thing, like staying is easy." He paused, and the next words came slowly, carefully, as if he were learning to speak a language he had once been fluent in. "No one ever just stayed before." They sat in a comfortable silence, the morning sun warming the small cabin. Something between them had shifted, not with drama or declaration, but with the quiet certainty of dawn after a long night. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and they both knew that whatever this was, it was no longer just kindness and gratitude. It was something that had its own gravity, its own warmth, its own name, though neither of them was brave enough to say it yet. "They will come," he said suddenly, his gaze turning to the door. "Reese, my father. They'll hear I shifted. They'll want to see, to test me, to pity me." The thought made his jaw tighten. "We could leave," Thea said. The words left her mouth before she had fully thought them through, but the moment they were in the air, she knew they were true. He looked at her, his eyes wide. "Leave? The territory?" "Why not?" she pressed, the idea taking firm root. "There's nothing for you here, Ivan. They put you in a cabin and called it mercy. They sent the pack healer to check on you twice in a year, and when she left, she told me not to pour my heart into an empty vessel." She saw his flinch and pressed on, not to wound, but to clarify. "That's what they see, a problem, a relic. And me? I'm just an omega who fetches and carries. We could go somewhere new, somewhere they don't know your name or your story. We could just be... She trailed off, searching for the word. Us, he finished. The word was quiet, but it held the weight of a man who had just discovered that us was a place he could live. Us. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating. To leave the only home they had ever known, to become rogues by choice. But the thought of staying, of Ivan being subjected to his family's judgment and her returning to a life of invisibility, was far worse. A new pack, he said, the words barely a whisper, but they held the weight of a proclamation. For the lost ones, like us. Thea's heart swelled. He wasn't just thinking of escaping, he was thinking of building. A sanctuary, she breathed. Yes. They moved with quiet urgency, knowing their time was limited. Ivan dressed in fresh clothes from the supply chest. While he was weak from the shift, a new strength radiated from him, the quiet authority of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side with his own name in his mouth. She packed the blankets, the thermos, the worn book of stories. They had nothing else. They didn't need anything else. Before they left, Ivan paused, his hand on the doorframe. He looked around the small, rough cabin, at the hearth where he had sat in silence for a year, at the mantelpiece lined with Thea's small gifts, at the table where a wildflower had once stood in place of words. He reached up and took the bluebird feather from the mantelpiece and tucked it gently into the pocket of Thea's coat. Then he turned to her, his expression serious. "My father gave me this cabin to forget me," he said, his voice gaining strength. "He named my brother heir because he thought I was gone forever. They don't get to decide my fate anymore." He reached out and gently took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, and the touch sent a jolt through her. Not supernatural, not fated, just the simple, devastating electricity of being touched by someone who means it. "I am not the lost alpha," he said, "and you are not just an omega. You are the person who walked into a dark room and refused to leave. That is worth more than any title this pack has ever given." They stepped out of the cabin and into the morning light, hand in hand. They took the same deer trail Thea had used the night before, narrow, overgrown, cutting through the deep forest where the patrols rarely ventured. They moved quickly but not recklessly, Ivan's recovering instincts guiding them along game paths and dry creek beds that left little trace. By the time the morning patrol would have checked the cabin and found it empty, they had already crossed the northern boundary marker and slipped into the unclaimed wilderness between pack territories. Their journey was not easy. They were two wolves with nothing but each other, navigating wild, indifferent country that did not care about their story. The first night, a cold rain set in, and they sheltered beneath a rock overhang barely large enough for both of them, pressed together for warmth, Thea's teeth chattering despite herself. Ivan pulled her closer without a word, wrapping the blanket around them both, his body a furnace of heat against the chill. She could feel his heartbeat against her back, steady, strong, alive. "Tell me something," she whispered into the dark, the rain drumming on the stone above them. "Anything." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "When I was in the cage, the worst part wasn't the pain. It wasn't the silver or the forced shifts. It was the silence. Weeks would go by and no one would speak to me, not a word, just hands in the dark, doing things. After a while, I started to forget what my own voice sounded like. I started to forget that I had one." His arm tightened around her. "And then you walked into that cabin and started talking to me about honey cakes, and I thought I was hallucinating. Because no one just talks to someone they think can't hear them. No one wastes their voice on someone who can't answer." His voice cracked, and he steadied it. "But you did, week after week. And I realized you weren't wasting anything. You were giving me back the sound of the world." Thea pressed her face against his shoulder and let the tears come. They were not tears of sadness, but of something larger, The overwhelming, almost unbearable tenderness of being trusted with someone's worst memory and knowing they gave it to you not as a burden, but as a gift. "I heard every word," she said. "Even when you couldn't answer, I heard you." "How?" "Because silence has its own language, Ivan, and yours was very loud." They traveled for 3 days, deeper into the unclaimed forest. Ivan's alpha instincts, dormant for so long, were reawakening. Not all at once, but in fitful bursts, like a muscle being used after years of atrophy. He tracked game by scent, found clean water, read the weather in the movement of birds. Some of it was clumsy. He led them into a bog on the second day and stood knee-deep in muck with such a look of offended dignity that Thea laughed until she couldn't breathe, and he looked at her, startled, and then the corner of his mouth twitched, and it was the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on his face. They talked for hours, filling the silence of the trail with the stories of their lives. She told him about growing up invisible, about the particular loneliness of being raised by a community that clothed and fed you, but never quite saw you. He told her about the pressure of being the heir, the weight of his father's expectations, the way the golden wolf had felt like a crown he'd never asked to wear. And in fragmented, painful sentences, he spoke of his capture. Not the details, those he would carry alone, perhaps forever. But he told her about the cold, the hunger, and the crushing loneliness that had almost extinguished his spirit. He told her about the moment his wolf had retreated, how it had felt like losing a limb, like a door slamming shut inside his own chest, and the terrible relief that came with it, because at least the rogues couldn't reach that part of him anymore. "He saved me by leaving," Ivan said of his wolf, his voice rough. "And you saved me by staying. I don't know how to make sense of that except to say that maybe we need both. Someone who knows when to go, and someone who knows when to hold on." On the 4th day, they found her. A she-wolf, huddled in a shallow cave at the base of a cliff, her fur matted and filthy, her ribs visible beneath her dull coat. Her eyes were wild with fear, and when she saw them, she snarled, a sound of pure animal terror, the sound of a creature that has learned to expect pain from every approaching figure. Ivan stopped walking. He didn't advance, didn't posture, didn't assert dominance. He simply sat down on the ground, his back against a tree, and waited. Thea followed his lead, settling beside him. She pulled a strip of dried venison from their dwindling supplies and placed it on the ground between them and the cave. "You're welcome here," Thea said softly, her voice carrying the same gentle steadiness she had once offered to a silent man in a dark cabin. "There is no judgment here. There is no test to pass. You're just welcome." The she-wolf did not come out, but she stopped snarling. They moved on, making camp a short distance away. In the morning, the venison was gone, and the she-wolf was sitting at the edge of their clearing, watching them with wary eyes. She didn't come close, but she didn't leave. By the 3rd day, she was walking behind them at a distance, close enough to be following, far enough to flee. On the 5th day, she shifted into a woman, young, thin, with dark hair and bruised eyes, and she told them her name was Lyra, and that she had been cast out by her pack for failing to produce pups for the beta she'd been promised to. Ivan listened to her story, and when she was done, he said, "You are not what they told you that you are." It was, Thea realized, the same thing she had been saying to him for a year, in 100 different ways. It was the founding principle of whatever they were building. Others found them, or they found others. A young male, barely more than a pup, named Callum, born with a lame leg and abandoned by his pack as a weakness to the bloodline. An old wolf named Gareth, his muzzle gray, who had been exiled when he could no longer keep up on the hunt. A pair of sisters, fierce and inseparable, who had been separated from their pack during a territorial war, and refused to go back to a place that had never tried to find them. One by one, the forgotten and the broken, the wolves who didn't fit the rigid structures of their old packs were drawn to the quiet strength of the scarred alpha and the boundless compassion of the woman at his side. They found a home in a secluded, sun-dappled valley, protected by high cliffs and blessed with a clean, running river. They built shelters, hunted together, kept watch in shifts. Ivan led not by command but by example. His scars a testament not to his weakness, but to the depth of what he had survived. Thea was the heart of their small community, the one who remembered everyone's name, who noticed when someone was struggling, who sat up with Lyra during her nightmares and taught young Callum to read. She was no one's servant. She was everyone's home. One evening, as the pack settled around a communal fire, their bellies full, Thea watched Ivan. He was listening to old Gareth tell a rambling story about a fish he had once caught that was this big, I swear on the moon. And a small, genuine smile was on his face. The hollowed-out man from the cabin was gone. In his place was someone she had watched come back to life piece by piece. And the realization hit her, quiet and absolute, that she loved him. Not because he was an alpha, not because of his wolf or his strength or his story. She loved him because of the wildflower on the table, because of the way he had taken the firewood from her arms, because he had asked, "Why do you keep coming?" And her answer had made him tremble. Because he left the door open for her, because he was kind to strays, because he had suffered more than anyone should and had chosen, against all reason, to be gentle. He caught her watching him, and his smile deepened into something private, something meant only for her. He crossed the clearing and sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "It's a good life," he said quietly, his voice smooth and sure now, nothing like the broken rasp of the cabin. "It's the life we made," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her, holding her close. She could feel the steady beat of his heart. "Thea." "I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish, because I've been practicing words for a long time now, and I'm still not very good at the important ones." She lifted her head and looked at him. The firelight played across his face, the scars, the strong jaw, the gray eyes that had once been hollow and were now so full of feeling it made her chest ache. "I don't know what I believe about fate," he said slowly. "I don't know if there's a force in the universe that puts people in each other's paths. But I know this. You walked into a dark room and you talked to a man who couldn't answer, and you kept coming back. And you brought him flowers and stories and honey cakes, and you believed he was still in there when everyone else, everyone, Thea, his father, his brother, the healers, the elders, had closed the book on him." His hand tightened on hers. "And I don't know if that's fate or if it's just you. But I don't need it to be fate. I don't need a cosmic reason. I just need it to be you. Because you are the reason. You are the whole reason." He turned his head, his lips brushing her temple in a kiss so soft it was barely a touch. "I choose you, Thea Lennox," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her skin. "Not because the moon told me to, or because the stars aligned, or because some ancient magic decided it. I choose you because you are the kindest, bravest, most stubborn person I have ever known, and because every good thing in my life started the day you pushed open my door and said hello." She was crying. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, but she was crying, and she didn't care. Because some tears are not about sadness. Some tears are just the body's way of saying, "This is more than I can hold." "And I choose you, Ivan Hunt," she whispered back, her hand rising to rest against his scarred cheek. "Not because you're an alpha, not because of the golden wolf or the story or the scars. I choose you because you left me a wildflower when you couldn't say a word. And that told me everything I needed to know about who you really are." He leaned his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cool night air, and for a long moment they stayed like that. Two people who had been invisible to the world, finding in each other the only audience that mattered. Then he kissed her, soft and slow and aching with tenderness, and the small pack around the fire pretended not to notice, except for old Gareth, who muttered, "About time," and went back to his story about the fish. It wasn't a grand declaration in a sacred circle. It was a whispered truth by a crackling fire, a promise made between two souls who had found each other in the dark. They were not just survivors. They were founders. And in their valley, under the patient gaze of the moon, a new forest was growing, stronger and more beautiful for all its broken branches.